People get persecuted for this. She was an extremely gifted psychic medium, and unfortunately she married this very conservative religious guy who looked at her ability as somehow evil. When my abilities started to manifest, my dad was very upset. And I remember he said to me, he goes, Mark, people see things that aren't there get taken away. It scared me. And then he explained to me, that to only talk to your mother and I about it. Well, that day, a crane was lifting thousands of pounds of steel beams. His cable snapped, and the machine shop that he worked in was crushed. Flat like a pancake that killed everybody in it. So if he'd been at work, pretty darn good chance that he would die. Well, you would think that he would have been somewhat grateful. Instead, he had her committed to a mental institution.
Tonight, Mark Anthony, the psychic lawyer. He's a fourth-generation psychic medium who communicates with spirits. He's also a successful attorney licensed to practice law in Florida, Washington, D.C., and before the United States Supreme Court. That and more coming right up on My Alien Life. My Alien Life is recorded live from atop the Northern Rocky Mountains and is available on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, and everywhere fine podcasts are found. My website is at www.myalienlifepodcast.com. There you will find my email address, all previously recorded shows, and more. I am Cameron Brower. This is My Alien Life, and the podcast starts right now.
My Alien Life Podcast.
Three, two, one, zero, and liftoff.
In the studio tonight is Mark Anthony, the psychic lawyer. Mark is a fourth-generation psychic medium, an attorney, and the author of Never Letting Go and Evidence of Eternity. Both books offer insight into the spirit world, and Mark Anthony is here tonight to offer us more insight into that world. Mark, thank you so much for joining me, and welcome.
Thank you, Cameron. I appreciate you having me on the show, and I'd like to thank all the listeners for tuning in.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. And tonight, Mark, we're celebrating together Friday the 13th, and I appreciate you having the courage to hang out with me. And tonight we have a lot to talk about, don't we?
We do. Friday the 13th is an auspicious day. And you know, Cameron, the National Phobia Institute, and there actually is it is a real thing, has they've estimated there are close to 30 million people in the United States that have a fear of Friday the 13th, which is technically called frigatriscadecaphobia. And that's why when you go into an office building or a hotel, try to find the 13th floor in the elevator, or try to find the 13th floor in the building. And there are so many people that won't leave their house. They won't go to work. They will change travel plans. That it's been estimated every time there's a Friday the 13th, businesses nationwide in the United States lose $2 billion every Friday the 13th. So it's a rather auspicious day for a lot of reasons.
Those are huge numbers, and I know the numbers are real. And what I really wanted to ask you tonight, we can talk about Friday the 13th too, but why do so many of us want to communicate with the dead? And when so many of us communicate very poorly with the living, especially now with so much media and the ability to text and whatever. We seem to lose touch with each other face to face.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? We have the most sophisticated ability to communicate with other human beings in the history of this planet, and it's actually making things worse. People don't pick up the phone and call; they insist on texting. Even people now are treating emails like we used to treat snail mail, and it is really, really fascinating that with all of this enhanced technology, it's actually creating poor social skills. People are no longer conversing. But to answer your question directly, why are so many people interested in communicating with the dead? Well, nothing is more painful than losing the death of a loved one. And it goes 100-fold for a parent who has lost a child. The bond between parent and child is like none other. It's devastating. It can cripple somebody emotionally, mentally, and spiritually for the rest of their lives when the child dies. And even though people may turn to their faith communities and read scripture that talks about everlasting life, it simply doesn't help. And the reason for that is you can read all the books, you can go to all the church services, and I'm not saying don't do that. And always reach out to your faith community and caring family and friends. But for a lot of people, the direct experience to hear from the spirit of the person who died, it validates your belief system that there is everlasting life. And it also shows, Cameron, that somebody that meant so much to you, someone that you loved so much, did not just disintegrate into nothingness, but that who and what they are continues on in a different state.
And excuse me, I think that is very important when you say that word validation, because obviously we want to know perhaps that we may be meeting them in the future, and that's our hope. But any other reason that people communicate other than that validation? I mean, is there other meaning for other people that's less friendly?
Absolutely. It's not just validation. Spirit communication is an important therapeutic step in the journey through grief, and it can also bring messages of love, healing, and resolution. I mean, there's a lot of times somebody that you love dies, and maybe you were not on speaking terms with that person, or maybe the last thing you said to them was something unkind, or maybe you felt that, gee, I could have done something different, or if I would have insisted on this medical treatment, they would have lived. Because in the wake of someone's death, Cameron, there's a lot of issues of guilt, remorse, and regret. And spirit communication can rectify those. It can also bring resolution in disputes that people had. It also lets people know that not even death can kill love. Now, I also know that there's a lot of people in the paranormal investigation field, and I've been on several paranormal investigations, and they like to analyze spectral phenomenon or spirit communication from let's say a more scientific standpoint, to see that if there is actually a means of proving the existence of an afterlife based on sound scientific principles. And that's why I like paranormal investigation, because it does start providing evidence through technology, through the scientific method, which is objective observation, that can prove that when we die, that the energy that's within our brain, which you and I may call the soul, and in the realm of psychology they call the consciousness, does not just cease to exist. And we know this from the laws of physics, the laws of thermodynamics, that energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred from one form to another. So the electromagnetic field in the brain, aka the soul, the spirit, transfers out of that brain and to a higher frequency, and if I can be so bold, to a different dimension. But that doesn't mean that it's inaccessible, and it also doesn't mean that we can't communicate with discarnate intelligence, meaning spirits.
So that sounds very tangible to me, and I'm very impressed that you're for the school of the scientific method. And I've asked in the past other people too, and it's you answered every question I would have had, but this is a physical property of a person. I mean, they still exist in a physical realm, just in a different frequency that we can't reach out and touch, correct?
Exactly. And the way I've been studying this for years, I'm an attorney, and now I'm put the focus of my career on spirit communication. I'm doing readings for people. I'm lecturing about this. I appear on shows like this as a paranormal expert and a legal analyst, especially when the paranormal and the legal collide. And we can talk about that later. But as an attorney, I've had to, I was a prosecutor at one point, criminal offense attorney at another, and then I did complex civil litigation. So I've had to work with scientists, neurologists, physicists, forensic experts on cases, and I've had to learn what their field of expertise was about so that I could ask them questions on the witness stand or cross-examine the opposition's experts, and that helped me develop an understanding of chemistry, biology, quantum physics, anatomy, physiology, frequency, and how the human brain works. That, my dad was a NASA engineer, and he was a part of the whole moon missions and the shuttle program and all of this with aerospace. So I've been surrounded by science since I could talk. And to me, the spiritual and the scientific are not mutually exclusive. And Cameron, I believe that there is a logical, rational explanation for everything based on science. And just because our technology may not be able to detect the presence of a soul, or we may not be able to put something at this point under a microscope or an electron microscope, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, because the theories and the scientific hypothesis of today all too often becomes the scientific reality of tomorrow. And I believe that it's just a matter of time before science will prove the existence of the afterlife. And also, based on my colleagues at the University of Arizona, my good friend Dr. Gary Schwartz is working on technology to communicate with spirits. So here you have a first-rate university, and which is engaged in the technology to prove that our consciousness does survive physical death. So it's all there, and I think that we live in an exciting time where we're going to be seeing this actually happen.
Talk about frequency one more time. Let me ask you, if we're at a certain frequency and the afterlife is at a different frequency, do we pass into their frequency more than they pass into ours? Do you see what I'm saying here?
I know exactly what you're saying.
We experience them on a very limited basis. Is it possible they experience us much more?
Well, of course, because they are pure energy. Oh boy, that was a loaded statement. Let me back up a bit. Albert Einstein said roughly 100 years ago, there is no matter, there's only energy which vibrates at different frequencies so as to be perceptible to the senses. And Einstein, Louis de Broglie, Werner Heisenberg, Max Planck, Oppenheimer, they all developed quantum physics. And we know from science that everything is made of molecules. Molecules are made of atoms. Atoms are made of electrons, protons, and neutrons. And Einstein and his colleagues put forth the theory, which we now know to be true, that electrons, protons, and neutrons are composed of a smaller particle, the most basic unit of everything, which is quanta. And quanta is electromagnetic energy. So, Cameron, what that means is that everything in existence at its most fundamental level is the same form of energy, electromagnetic energy. And so a desk vibrates at a lower frequency because it's an inanimate object than you do, okay? But the air that you're breathing is also made of quanta. The light that we're seeing is also composed of quanta. The space between the earth, the sun, and the stars is all made of quanta. In other words, everything is energy. So Einstein was right about that. So in our human body, you have the brain. And the brain, while it houses our consciousness, aka our soul, it doesn't create it. Okay, that energy pre-exists in the body, comes into the body, and then moves on after the body and the brain die. So think of your brain as essentially a computer hard drive. And so when the hard drive crashes, we get uploaded to the cloud. Okay? Now, to answer your question directly about the frequency, so here in the material world, that's what I call our world, let's call that AM radio. Let's call the other side FM radio. And what happens is we can raise our frequency, and spirits in FM radio, they lower their frequency, and occasionally there's a frequency match. Okay, the reason they are able to observe us and participate more in our world than we are to them is because they are at such a high vibration, and from our perspective, pure energy, they're not burdened by the lower, slower vibration of being in the material world. So they can zap back and forth between their dimension to ours. We, to perceive them, have to bring up our brainwave frequency to a higher level. And people do that in the sleep state, or they have visitations, or there's people like me that, for various reasons, we're able to adjust our brainwave frequency to a higher level. So they're always around us. It's just that some people are more sensitive to that frequency than others. And between the FM radio and the AM radio, that's the zone where the spirit communication takes place. Now, for the people who are listening to this, I'm not saying that we're AM and they're FM. I'm using this as an example. Our vibration is lower and slower. Theirs is much more rapid because they're pure energy, but there's like a neutral zone, if you will, in between, where the frequencies can overlap, and that's where you will perceive a spirit or be able to communicate with one. I hope that answers your question.
Good answer. I talked to a gentleman not long ago, and we did a podcast, and we talked about exorcism, and he's an exorcist. So basically, he's performing exorcisms, and he also talked about inherent evil. So not only are there the spiritual remains of humans that are in this world, but it seems that there's other things like inherent evil and demons and any idea how many different entities exist within this same realm, or are they in that same realm?
Well, with all due respect to your other guest, I do not believe in hell. I do not believe in demons. But I do know that there's a lot of non-human spiritual intelligence on the other side. And a lot of people, if they encounter something that's non-human intelligent, they don't understand it, they immediately label it as negative and evil. And I think that's the problem with a lot of the paranormal research and even mediums, is that they're bogged down in Victorian era nonsense that, demons and devils and all that nonsense. There's positive and negative energy for sure, but there's different frequencies on the other side. I do not believe in inherent evil in the spiritual sense. However, I believe in inherent evil in the human sense. The devil is the human ego, edging God out. Because whenever you do anything negative to another person, you're not acting out of love for that person. You're acting out of your own self-centered desires, the ego. And human beings don't need any manipulative, negative spirits to motivate them to do horrible things to each other. Okay, we're very capable of doing that. Our history certainly indicates that. It's going on in this world. I mean, humans in humanity to other humans is basically the story of planet Earth. So on the other side, for example, I was in England, and I was in an area where they said there's a ferry. Ferries are here. And I'm like, yeah, right. And I walk around, whoa. And there were definitely spirits there that were not human. Then I felt similar spirits in Mexico, in the Yucatan. I felt them on a paranormal investigation in the Rocky Mountains, and I felt them in temples in Japan where they call them kami, which is K-A-M-I, which is part of the Shinto religion. So it became very apparent to me that there are spirits who are intelligent that are aligned either with plants, minerals, animals. In other words, they're not so much aligned or interested in people. They are associated with either other life forms or other things in this world, And the people who, the devil crowd wants to immediately assume that these are negative and evil simply because they're not interested in us, or I don't want to say they're hostile to us, but let's say that entities that are more focused on plants could really care less about human beings, or maybe have an attitude towards humans since we, burn and deforest and basically, exploit natural resources that these entities are aligned with. But that doesn't make them evil or demonic. The idea that there is a central command of evil with a James Bond type villain sitting there like, that to me is a bunch of medieval, Bronze Age, Iron Age, paranoid, superstitious nonsense that we need to let go. Conversely, the idea that God is a neurotic white guy sitting on a throne with a scepter, smiting people because they don't read the King James Version of the Bible and give 10% of their paycheck to a religious organization, is also a bunch of paranoid medieval nonsense. God does exist, and God exists in spite of religion, not because of religion. God is the energy that flows through us, around us, with us, and connects us, which we now know as quantum electromagnetic energy. And there's an intelligence which flows through this, which is the source of all light, power, creation, love, and interconnectedness in the universe. So it's time that we get away from the negativity of this demonic nonsense and of these rigid religions which say, my way is the only way, and if you don't believe me, you're going to this mythical place that we call hell. I mean, I could sit here, and since it's Friday the 13th, I could explain the development of hell and where it came from over the centuries, if you want me to.
What about exorcism? You've actually attended one, correct? And you've witnessed that?
Yeah, I did. I attended an exorcism in the Amazon. Let me back up a second before we get into that. There are different types of mediums. I'm what's known as a mental medium. In other words, spirits transmit information to me, and my brain converts it into recognizable concepts based on my memories, feelings, and cultural associations. So that way, the spirit tells me or transmits information to me, I present it to you, and then I get, and then you verify what's being given to me. Then there's physical mediums. Although I know that throughout history there have been real physical mediums which were able to project from their body ectoplasm, which forms the image of the person communicating. I have observed a few people that pass themselves off as physical mediums. It is the most ridiculous and absurd thing I've ever witnessed. When anyone tells you that you have to sit in a dark room, okay, and have your hands restrained, like there's 20 people in a dark room, and the physical meeting sitting there, and they have to play loud music in between the transitions from one spirit coming into the next because of a vibrational thing, please, okay, that's a bunch of leftover Victorian era hucksterism. So I've yet to see any physical mediums that even come close to being taken seriously. Then the third type of medium would be a trance medium, which in the U.S. we refer to as channelers, such as Edgar Cayce. Edgar Cayce, known as the Sleeping Prophet, he died back in 1947. He left the Edgar Cayce Association for Research and Enlightenment. I'm speaking at their Ancient Mysteries Conference, October 10th through the 13th of 2019. But Edgar Cayce, he would go into a trance and spirits would speak through him. And he gave wonderful medical cures and all types of insights into God as energy. And the reason that I'm bringing all this up, Cameron, there's a lot of people who are trance mediums and don't realize it. And so what happens is, until they learn how to control it, other spirits can, I don't want to say possess them, but start to come into their body and start transmitting information through them. And throughout the centuries, this has been interpreted as demonic possession. And that's why people do these exorcisms, because all of a sudden somebody starts, having a bunch of elementals going through them. There's one soul per customer, okay? So you can't have your soul possessed by a demon because, number one, demons don't exist. Number two, the devil doesn't exist. But there are people who don't know that they're trance mediums, don't know how to control it, and it would be a logical conclusion to assume that these people are in some way possessed. So that is my opinion, my conclusion, based on lifetime study of mediumship of what possession is.
What was that like when you found out that you had this ability? I mean, is it traumatic? Is it scary at first? How did you feel?
Well, I was 3.5. It was just sort of like I had invisible friends. And this is a genetic trait that runs in my family because both my parents had these abilities, and I've tracked it going back centuries. We know that it goes back at least into the 1800s on both my mother's and father's side of the family. In fact, my mother, her family, they came from Italy, and her grandmother, who'd be my maternal great-grandmother, Giovanna, she was actually, there was a PBS special, I think 3 years ago, back in 2016, called The Italian Americans. And it was, several hours, and PBS did it. And there was an entire segment where they focused on Giovanna, my maternal grandmother, and referenced her psychic abilities. And she was known in the New York and North Jersey Italian communities as the woman who knew things because she had these amazing abilities. So it was really cool seeing like, oh, wow, there's actual documented evidence going back to the early part of the 1900s. So for me, spirit communication has never been scary. It's never been terrifying. I look at it as an enhanced ability to communicate with a higher realm. And so when I was about 3.5 and I started seeing my invisible friends, my parents were also capable of perceiving them. And I'll never forget, like my mom was like, oh my gosh, he can do this. He's one of us. My dad was like, oh my gosh, he can do this. He's one of us. Because
here we go again.
Well, because my dad's family was from Pennsylvania, and they were Northern Baptists. In fact, his grandfather was a Baptist minister, but his sister Marjorie, his mother Isabel, and his grandmother Grace, his maternal grandmother, were all mediums, including my dad. But they kept it under wraps. They didn't talk about it openly. It was sort of this thing that they did behind closed doors. Whereas on the Italian side of the family, Giovanna, she died in her 90s, and people would come in and like, I don't want to say, they showed her great signs of respect up until her 90s, and the Catholic Church in that area treated her with the respect they would a mother superior, because they knew that they called it that she was receiving visions of the Holy Spirit. So it just depends on how people label this and look at it. And so when these abilities started to manifest with me, my parents were very understanding, and they told me, Mark, you can talk about this with us, but don't tell people outside the house because they won't understand. And then as I started getting older, I saw that, well, not everybody's family was like mine. It's like we're seeing, not at all. And especially when you grow up in Florida, and there's all the Bible thumpy people that,
Well,
the problem with religious people is they find evil everywhere. The devil's
True.
in the sugar bowl. The devil's in the box of, Lucky Charms. The devil's in the garage waiting to... Yeah, it is, and it reminds me of something that Abraham Lincoln said. He said that when the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, then everything starts to look like a nail.
Right. So how prevalent is this? Because, we don't see sitcoms about the family that has a psychic medium. We don't see that. So how often does it happen, and are we just ignoring it?
Well, I think that it's much more widespread than people understand. But the problem is, people get persecuted for this. My father's sister Marjorie, she was an extremely gifted psychic medium, and unfortunately, she married this very conservative religious guy who looked at her ability as somehow evil. And when my abilities started to manifest, my dad was very upset. And I remember he said to me, he goes, "Mark, people who see things that aren't there get taken away." And it scared me. And then he explained to me, that to only talk to your mother and I about this. Well, what I found out when I got older, because I never met my Aunt Marjorie, at least not in the when she was in this world. Her husband worked at this machine shop at a steel plant in Pennsylvania, and one morning he was getting ready to go to work, and she said, "You're not going to work. I got a terrible feeling. I'm getting pains in my stomach when I think about you going to work." And she basically threw a fit, and he was like, "Oh, fine, you and that hocus pocus." So he begrudgingly agreed to stay home. Well, that day, a crane was lifting thousands of pounds of steel beams, and the cable snapped, and the machine shop that he worked in was crushed, flattened like a pancake, and it killed everybody in it. So if he'd been at work, there's a pretty darn good chance that he would have died. Well, you would think that he would have been somewhat grateful. Instead, he had her committed to a mental institution.
Wow.
And literally, an ambulance pulled up, two guys in white coats. She was screaming as they dragged her out of her home, took her to a mental institution, and she was subjected to electroshock therapy for over a period of 6 months. They essentially fried her brain, and my dad and my mom were just horrified that he could do this. In fact, my mom said that man would never set foot in our house. She goes, "How dare he do that to her?" And Aunt Marjorie was only a shadow of what she'd once been. And that's because in that time frame, people who saw spirits were thought to be schizophrenics and delusional. Okay? Now let's go a couple centuries ago in Western Europe. Look at Joan of Arc. Okay, she was a clairaudient medium who said she was receiving messages from Michael the Archangel, Saint Margaret, and Saint Catherine of Alexandria. Okay, you can say, well, she was probably nuts, but for the fact the French army rallied around her and they drove the English out of France in the 100 Years' War. Okay, so if she was nuts, how did she accomplish that? You see what I'm saying? And then of course the English capture her and burn her at the stake as a witch. So throughout the centuries, unless you were part of the clergy and receiving visions of the Holy Spirit, like Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint Clare of Assisi and Saint Francis of Assisi and Saint Anthony of Padua and the children at Fatima, Bernadette at Lourdes, okay, they were all sanctioned as they're receiving visions of the Holy Spirit. If you weren't part of the clergy, you got burned at the stake, hung, or in the case of my Aunt Marjorie, subjected to electroshock therapy. In Islamic countries, like in Saudi Arabia, they behead you for these abilities. So the reason, Cameron, that being a medium, being able to communicate with spirits, being a psychic, being able to foresee future events, it's ridiculed, it's persecuted, and that's why it's only now becoming mainstream or more mainstream and more openly discussed. And because a lot of people are afraid of what will happen to you.
Still, it eludes the mainstream. We don't have the people that perform this and make a living and want to make a living doing this still have to kind of remain in the shadows a little bit. Do you see any sort of enlightenment coming where we're going to accept this?
I do, and the problem with psychics is that the history of psychics has been fraught with fraud.
True.
Just a few years ago, there was the Rosa Marks case in South Florida, and she was part of the gypsy subculture. And I'm not making any negative, comments about people of that
Sure.
subculture, but when you see the neon signs with the hand and it says "psychic see your future" and all that, that's probably part of that culture, and you should avoid that. But she was persuading people that their loved ones were somehow trapped in hell and that only she could get them out of it. And she built people, something like 100 people out of almost $30 million by telling them that they had to come to her 3 times a week, like at $1,500 a pop, so that she could free their loved ones from hell. And there was a famous author. Her name was Jude Devereaux. Her little boy was killed in a car accident, and this charlatan persuaded her that her little boy was suffering in hell, and bilked almost $5 million out of this author. Well, luckily, she was arrested and was convicted, and I think a lot of the money, at least what was left of it, was reimbursed to the victims. And that's where things go wrong, because rotten apples spoil it for the rest of us. Because there's a lot of legitimate psychics and mediums, and but the people that go around and convince you, or try to convince you, that there's a curse on you, that there's a spirit attached to your aura, you're being haunted, that a loved one is in hell, and you have to come to them for repeated sessions. Those are frauds. Stay away from them. A legitimate psychic or medium, you check their credentials, their background. If they have a website, read it. If they have a book, certainly read it, and talk to other people or read testimonials about them. And yes, mediums charge money because if they have to support themselves. But do your research, do your due diligence. Also, like with me, I tell people you shouldn't have a reading for at least 6 months after the death of the loved one. It's not because the loved one can't communicate. I mean, spirits can communicate right away. I've been at deathbeds where people have died and then their spirit comes to me moments afterwards. But you need time to get through the initial shock of the grief, and then get to the point where your emotions begin to stabilize, so that then you will get the most out of the spirit communication. And then I tell people, if you do want subsequent readings, please wait at least 6 months. Okay, if you start getting a psychic or a medium says, "We need to come to me every week," then that's when you turn and run, because a legitimate psychic and a legitimate psychic medium will tell you that you must wait several months between readings, because you need to get to a different point in your life, a different place with your grief, so that the messages that come through at subsequent readings will pertain to what's going on now and not be duplicates of what you received in an earlier reading. Because our life is an ongoing process, as is our grief. So anyway, I hope that answers your question.
How do you get started in this? I mean, do you automatically, as a 3-year-old, you're able to communicate, or does this develop as you get older, and are you able to communicate more effectively with practice? How does that work?
All of the above. It's like, could Michael Phelps swim when he was 3? He probably could, but he needed coaching. He needed practice to develop technique. I was able to perceive psychics. I was able to perceive spirits when I was a kid, and I could feel the presence around. And so then I got to this one point, my mom would teach me a lot of things, like, if you feel this, go with that. Don't jump to conclusions, try to be objective about it. And certainly the more you do it, the better you get at it, because it's like any other skill. And I remember I went to a mediumship development class, and when it was done, the guy said, "Hey, Mark, can you hold on for a minute?" And everybody else laughed. He goes, "How long have you been doing this?" I go, "Well, this is the first time I've ever gone to a class." He said, "I've never seen anything like you." He goes, "I can't teach you." He said, "You're doing this like someone who's been doing it 30 or 40 years. And I'm like, "Really?" He said, "You've got to go to England. And there's a college there, the Arthur Findlay College for the Advancement of Psychic Science. And they've developed British evidential mediumship, and they approach spirit communication from a scientific viewpoint. And what they do is they tell you, like, okay, when you see this, recognize this." And they were giving us different ways of approaching it to get the most information that you can from the spirits. So, but it's not like they enhanced my ability. They just showed me what to look for. And since that time, I've developed my own technique and my own way of seeing and explaining things. And it's funny because like when I do mediumship demonstrations, other mediums come to watch because they say, we like the way that you explain this and the way that you look at it. So it is a gift from God. It is an ability some people have. Not everybody has it. And like any skill set or talent, you need practice and you need to cultivate it.
What do you hear, feel? Do you actually hear voices? How does this work? Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I get, if people want to find out what happens with me, please go to my website, which is evidenceofeternity.com. Go to my media room, or just once you're on my website, evidenceofeternity.com, click on my YouTube channel. I've got close to 90 videos on there, and there's a lot of them where I've been filmed doing readings for groups of people. Also when I'm on television and doing readings on television. So when I open up to frequency and a spirit comes forward, what'll happen, Cameron, is first I'll feel the gender, then I may get an idea of their connection to the person. Like if they're like a brother, sister, cousin, spouse, friend, or on the parent, aunt, uncle level, or the child, niece, nephew. And then they're going to transmit to me identifiers such as how they died. And I'll say I'm feeling like pressure here, and sometimes they'll give me the exact cause of death. Like today I did a reading and a spirit came through and said perforated ulcers. And I thought the client was going to fall out of her chair, and she goes, well, that's exactly how my dad died. He had a perforated ulcer, and she started, in all the areas in my stomach and my lower intestines where I was feeling the pain and the pressure. So when they transmit to me like how they died, it doesn't physically injure me, but I do feel the sensation. And then I'm going to see things. I may see what they look like, or they'll show me things like from their life. It's like watching little mini movies. And then they'll give me I may hear names. They may sing a song, or rather project to me a song that has some relevance. I mean, it's every reading's different, but I see, hear, taste, smell, touch, sense, and sometimes they'll bring up future events that are going to happen to the person that I'm doing the reading for. So I'm not a fortune teller, but if a spirit will bring up a future event, and sometimes we don't know it's a future event. They'll describe something, and somebody says, "What? That's never happened to me." And then a month later, I'll get an email and go, "Oh my God, that happened to me." So
people are actually out there recording voices. Is that a real thing?
Yes, they are. The electric voice phenomenon. Absolutely, because once again, we're back to frequency.
Sure.
And so when the spirits are coming out of their dimension and lowering their frequency, and the EVP is able to pick up on things. In fact, something like that happened to me. I was at a paranormal conference, and all of a sudden my manager, she was like maybe 100 feet away, and she's like, "Mark, get over here." And I had a bunch of people I was talking to, and so I walked over there, and it was a colleague of mine who was selling EVP equipment. And I walk up, and she goes, "Mark, you're not going to believe this." And I walk up, and all of a sudden I hear, "Dude." And I look at the EVP, and I'm like, I know that voice. She goes, "Love you, bro." And I almost fell over, because it was my best friend who had a year before committed suicide. That was his voice coming out of this thing.
Wow. And
what had happened was Rocky was walking by, and all of a sudden she heard "Get Mark" come out of this machine, and she's like, "What?" And the guy's son goes, "That said Get Mark." And she's looking at him, she goes, "I know that voice," because she knew my best friend too. And then she yells, "Hey, Mark, come over." And the thing is, my friend was a surfer, and he always used to call me bro, and he'd go, "Love you, dude," like that. And I mean, I actually heard his voice come out of this. And this paranormal investigator that was selling the EVP, he didn't know any of this. Right. I mean, we were in Colorado. I'm from Florida. He had no idea about any of the connection. And then I'm hearing my best friend's voice come out of this EVP machine. So, the technology is here, and it's improving. And we're going to get to the point, like we were discussing before, Cameron, where technology will be able to prove not only do spirits exist, but the afterlife exists and life is eternal.
So I just thought of this huge question, and this is something I don't think I've ever thought about, but you're describing, let me take, for example, you have a normal, healthy human being and who is vibrating at a certain frequency. Does their spirit vibrate at a different frequency at the same time within that body? And if so, can two people get together and experience each other from a not a human, physical, but a spiritual way? I mean, you hear people talk about experiencing somebody spiritually. Is that actually possible?
I believe that it is, and there's a whole realm of studies. The Monroe Institute for Out-of-Body Experiences, which have also been referred to as astral projection.
There's that.
They focus very heavily on that. When people talk about having a spiritual experience, or your spirit touching somebody else's, and that's a very good point that you brought up about is the spirit within us vibrating at a different frequency. I'm going to go out on a limb and say yes, because we are multidimensional beings, and even though we have a spirit that's within our brain, that spirit, once again, we're all interconnected energetically. So that spirit is then interconnected with the quantum electromagnetic fields around us, which tie into other dimensions, which tie into the collective consciousness of all the spirits that are interconnected. So that's why, when I'm called to a deathbed and the person may be very heavily sedated, but I start to be able to communicate with their spirit, because even though the person is technically still alive, their consciousness begins to wander. And occasionally I've communicated with people who have been in comas, and I've been there when people are dying and transitioning. And the family brings me in, and I start telling them all the spirits that are lining up to help that person when they leave their body. I was at one deathbed, and I identified 27 spirits, and the family confirmed who 21 of them were. And the other 6, they weren't sure, because they figured it was, back on the grandparent or great-grandparent level. And the thing is, I didn't know any of these people. And I said, well, I was getting names, what they look like, how they died, their personalities, and all this. And including this one lady, I said, there's a cat, an orange tabby cat named Harpo. And I'm like, what? And all of a sudden, the kids, they're all looking at each other, and they go, our mom had a orange tabby cat named Harpo 40 years ago. Okay. Now, when people accuse me of cold reading, really, how do I cold read that?
Right.
Let's fling out an orange tabby cat and use the name Harpo
It's
and
very
see if
specific.
I get a hit.
Yeah.
So for all the people who say are cold reading, I got 2 words to say to you: forgive you.
Yes. If you die a traumatic death, does that trauma follow you, or can you shake that and not take it to the other spiritual
I
world?
don't. Yeah, that's more that paranoid, primitive nonsense that I'm hoping those of us who approach science from a scientific standpoint. I don't buy the wounded souls, the traumatic death. Here's the thing: when you die, your electromagnetic field pops out of your brain. It's like a drop of water, and then it plunges into the infinity of the collective consciousness, which means now your spirit, being pure energy, is suddenly linked to other spirits, or linked to other spirits, so on and so forth. And you know it right away. But then, Cameron, you might ask, but what about places where ghost hunters and paranormal investigators go, and there's a spirit running around, holding its severed head around, and all that?
Yeah, what about that?
That's because that is residual energy echo, because matter retains vibration. So typically in a place where there has been a violent death, could be a suicide, it could be a murder, it could be, all sorts of things. And the spirit's not there, but it's like dropping a rock into a pond in concentric circles. Okay, emanate from that, but now they keep reverberating back and forth. So it's like an echo that keeps going on and on and on. And so people pick up on the energy being held or bonded to a particular area, and then they think that this is a sentient spirit, whereas that residual energy echo, that spirit running around holding its severed head, is no more an immortal living being than your reflection in a mirror is you. And so that's why people who do the exorcisms and the house clearings and things like that, what they're doing is they're breaking that echo. They're deflecting it away. And so from that standpoint, I'll agree with the exorcists and the house clearers, because that's what you're doing. You're deflecting that echo away, literally clearing that energy so that goes away. Because there's three schools of thought on hauntings. The first one's what I just explained, and that's what it is. Number two, that the spirit's somehow trapped here. That's absolute nonsense, because once you're out of your body, you're not sick, you're not infirm, you're not mentally deranged. All those are physical and mental illnesses which are akin to the body and die with the body. Once you leave your brain, okay, you revert to that immortal state. You're part of the collective consciousness. You're not going to walk around like, haunting some place, although there may be residual echo energy. The third school of thought is that spirits come back to visit a particular area, and that's very possible and probably does happen. I'm not really sure why you'd want to go back to where you were murdered, but then again, spirits being pure electromagnetic energy are moving at the speed of everything in the electromagnetic spectrum, which is the speed of light. So they could pop in and out and be there for, in their reckoning, a few moments, which, for us could be a couple hours. But the thing is, spirits move at the speed of light. So that's how they're able to come from the other side to here so quickly. So this whole thing about haunted houses and haunted areas, I tend to think it's more the residual energy echo that the material has absorbed, the material as in the ground or the building absorbs that vibration more than it is a spirit hanging out there. Because, let me ask you this, Cameron. So you're an immortal living spirit. Do you want to hang out forever in a garbage dump, or do you want to go to a beach in Maui?
I'd be looking for some sweet digs, because just are they
Exactly.
limited? Are they limited though? Is there travel involved there, or are you limited to that same area?
Well, it appears on the other side that there's levels and frequencies.
What about time and
because
space?
Everything. On the quantum level, from what the physicists have theorized, there is no time. And that's why spirits and people that have psychic ability are able to foresee future events, because what you and I call the future, or the past or the present, is all a simultaneous thing occurring. It's all occurring simultaneously. I wrote a chapter about that in my new book that I'm working on, and it took me a while, quite a while, to kind of wrap my head around that. But once again, we're looking at things from a finite human perspective, and we believe that time exists and moves in one direction. Where on the quantum level, on that basic fundamental electromagnetic level, there is no time. So for spirits, transcending time and space is like no big deal. For us, we perceive things on the basis of what we know, and everything that we know and can experience has limitations. Ergo, we think that it's not possible.
Gives me a lot to think about. Let's back up a little bit, because I had to ask you about exorcism, and hopefully somebody wants to know about that. You experienced one, when and where was that?
It was in the Amazon. I was on a research ship, and we were in the Peruvian part of the Amazon. And I think we were on the Urubamba River, Urubamba or the Ucayali. they're all in the same region. They all come out of the Andes and then feed into the Amazon. And it was really cool because we're on this clankety research boat. There's like maybe a dozen crew, and I think there was only a dozen passengers. And the Amazon's intense. I mean, we're at night. We're the only source of light, okay? Because we had like floodlights on the top of the boat, and like God, hordes of insects would just be like flooding down. These giant bats are swooping around eating the insects. It was like a real trip standing on the deck, like, duck, there's bats, but it was kind of neat, And our guide, he was this really cool Aymara Indian. His name was Angel, and it's funny, like everyone's calling him beloved god of the Amazon because from what we could tell, he had like 27 children from 8 different women or something. Right. I mean, but he was like really cool, really interesting guy. And so we're chugging up the Amazon, and we're going by these villages. There's no running water. There's no electricity. I mean, this is as primitive as it gets. And all of a sudden, it was probably maybe about 4:30 in the afternoon, and all these canoes come up to the boat, and there's all these these locals in them, and they're talking to Angel, and he turned and he said, the Brujo is in the village ahead. Well, Brujo means witch doctor, and the Brujo said he wanted to invite the Americans, particularly talks to ghosts, and that meant me. And everyone's looking at me like, how did he know you're here? Well, apparently rumors spread as quickly in the Amazon and gossip as they do anywhere else. Because a couple days earlier, we'd been at some village and got around that I was a medium, and I guess it kind of spread up the river. So we chug up to this embankment, and we take the skiff over to this village, and there's about 100 people in the village, and I'm expecting the witch doctor have like bones, chicken bones through his nose and feathers, but he walks up and he's wearing a t-shirt and a baseball cap, and it was like expecting to look like you might think, a stereotypical thing from one of those old movies. But the village was extremely primitive. Like I said, no running water, no electricity. And he said that a woman is possessed by demons, and he was going to perform an exorcism. And there was only 6 of us that were brave enough to go. And I was like, oh, I have got to see this. So we go to this hut, and everyone had to sit in a circle. And this woman's laying face down in the middle of the hut, and there was a little fire next to her, and it was like her husband, I guess, and her mother were there, and they looked all really scared. And so the Brujo was explaining what he was doing in Aymara, which is a language they speak in this part of the jungle, to Angel, and then Angel would translate it to us in English. And it was really fascinating because he was explaining what he was doing. Like if we were at Harvard Medical School and the surgeon was saying, I am now, taking the scalpel and cutting the, this and that. And he was explaining it really technically. And he had all these little containers, all these little bottles with these liquids. And he's pouring the liquids on her back, and then he's licking her back and slurping it. And then he'd spit this gooey stuff into his palm of his hand. And I'll never forget, because I'm like on my knees and I'm sitting. To my left is this botanist, and to the right was this orthopedic surgeon, and his wife was next to him. And this guy spits this big globby thing in his hand and goes, "These are the demons." And I can hear the surgeon's wife like, "Oh God," like that. And he flings this glob of phlegm and goo into the fire.
Wow.
And he says, "I return the demons to the fire of shadows," and all this. And the orthopedic surgeon whispers to me, he goes, "That woman has a herniated disc in her back." So someone who looks perfectly healthy has this horrible pain in her back that nobody can explain, so she must be possessed by devils.
Right.
And the Brujo was called from several villages away to come and exorcise the demon out of her. Okay? And so this fire is sputtering and spurting, and by now it's dark outside. And then El Brujo looks at me and says something, and Angel looks at me and says he wants to know if the demons are gone. And everybody's looking at me, and it's like super awkward, because here we are in the middle of this village, in the middle of 100 people who believe this is for real, and we're like the six token Americans. And the botanist next to me, she's smiling, and she goes, "Don't blank this up, Mark."
You got a decision to make.
I look at El Brujo and go, "There are no demons here." And it gets translated, and the people are like, "Yay!" And then he goes, "Now I will prevent the demons from returning." And he gets this herb out, and the botanist goes, "Oh, dear God, he can't be serious." I go, "What?" She goes, "That's the Peruvian version or the Amazonian version of poison ivy." And he starts whipping this woman's back with it, and you can start seeing the red welts forming on her back. And the orthopedic surgeon's going, "Oh, my God, I can't believe he's doing that." And he said, "She'll feel better in a week." And I'm like thinking, well, how could she possibly feel worse? And so like, oh, when it was all over, we're thanking them for letting us do some. Boy, we couldn't wait to get back to the ship, okay? Because, we this is one of those things these weren't, relatively nice people, but if you said the wrong thing, I mean, nobody knows we're there, okay? So I was discussing this with the surgeon and the botanist when we were safely back on the ship, and he said that, well, yeah, she'll feel better because there's this terrible inflammation, and she's going to be in excruciating pain for several days, and then when the poison ivy begins to subside, she'll think she's better, but he says it's not going to cure the herniated disc. So, yes, I have seen an exorcism because people, and I mean no disrespect to the indigenous population in this area, but they're ignorant of medical science and neurology, and so therefore a pain of unknown origin in a person who looks young and healthy, it can only mean the unknown, which they interpret as something negative and evil and scary, ergo she was possessed by a devil. And then he's doing all this stuff with poison ivy where she'll feel worse and then feel better, and think that to some extent the devil has been exorcised or contained. Wow. So that is what people have to realize in all these exorcisms and all this. Yeah, there could be spiritual entities taking part here, but before we leap into the arms of fictional Satan, it could be a spiritual entity that's a non-human intelligence that we need to persuade to leave. And I guess from that standpoint, it is an exorcism. But I don't believe in the guy with the pitchfork and the eternal damnation, because that was just, it's an outmoded, primitive superstition coming from the Bronze Age.
Right. So you're also an attorney. How do these two worlds collide in a practical application for you?
Well, they're both about helping people, and they're both about evidence. And it's because of my background as an attorney that I approach what I do as a medium with objectivity, and I don't jump to conclusions. And also that as a medium, I'm an evidential medium. So I could say to you, oh, your grandmother's here and she loves you because, well, everybody's grandmother loves them. But I have to present evidence that specific facts, data, things that I could not possibly know that indicate who the spirit is, and then start to bring forth messages of love, healing, and resolution that are beneficial to you or, to someone close to you. And so that is how the two coincide. Also, I've been called to assist police in investigations. The case that I did, if you look on my website, evidenceofaternity.com, go to my YouTube site, when I was on the doctors, the information that I gave helped lead to the arrest of the killer in a cold case. And I was also asked to provide information for a mini-series, The Disappearance of Crystal Rogers, behind the scenes, and everything I gave coincided with the investigation. So it's because my legal background, they tend to look at me more credibly than other mediums.
Right. Before we go tonight, if you could, I would love it if you could tell everybody about your two books, Never Letting Go and Evidence of Eternity, because those are both available on Amazon and Goodreads. What do we expect in those?
Well, Never Letting Go and Evidence of Eternity, yes, they're available on Amazon and in all fine bookstores. Never Letting Go has been recommended by hospices and grief counselors worldwide. It's in several different languages, and it's a guide on the journey through grief. It will teach you how to recognize signs from spirits, and it will bring you messages of healing and resolution based on information transmitted from spirits. So basically, it's how spirits reach out from the other side to help people endure the grieving process. And a lot of people find this book particularly healing and helpful in the early stages of grief. It's like when you're in that fog and you're looking for something to help you get through. Evidence of Eternity bridges the gap between the spiritual and the scientific by explaining the afterlife and spirit communication based on science, theoretical physics, human physiology, and evidence. And I do believe that faith and science are not mutually opposed, but what people of faith have always known about the afterlife and eternal life is now being proven through quantum physics. And Evidence of Eternity was the first book of this genre to be up for a Pulitzer Prize. So I'm very, very honored,
very cool,
and humbled by how both of my books, they're in like a dozen different languages. Evidence of Eternity is an audiobook, and Never Letting Go will soon be an audiobook, and they are available worldwide. And people can find out about them on my website, evidenceofeternity.com.
What's coming up, Mark? Where can we see you?
Oh, gosh, I'm going to be in October 10th through the 13th in Virginia Beach at the Edgar Cayce Center for the Edgar Cayce Center, or at their Ancient Mysteries Conference. And the presentation I'll be giving is Rulers, Royals, Psychics, and Spirits, the Mystics Behind the Thrones of Power. And it's a really fun and exciting presentation. And then after that, I'll be doing a mediumship demonstration for the crowd. Then in November, between the 8th and the 12th, I'll be in Houston. I'll be on the CBS morning TV show, Great Day Houston, on KHOU with host Deborah Duncan. She's amazing. And then I'll be at Body, Mind, and Soul, which is a very popular metaphysical bookstore for 2 nights of spirit communication. Then I will be speaking in Sarasota in December at a spiritualist church, and also for a group for parents who've lost children here in Florida. So if people want to find out about my 2019 tour and my upcoming 2020 tour, please sign up for my newsletter and visit my website at evidenceofeternity.com. You can also find out about booking a telephone reading with me, which is just as accurate as an in-person reading. And Cameron, we were talking before we went on air. You're based out of Montana.
You bet.
I'm really hoping that in 2020 that I'm going to be getting to Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas. I'm really fascinated in that part of the country, and so everyone wants to keep up with my tour schedule. Please sign up for my newsletter, and that'll keep you updated on all that. And that's evidenceofeternity.com. Cameron, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Get to Montana, Mark. It's beautiful. Mark Anthony has been my guest, and both books, Never Letting Go and Evidence of Eternity, are available on Amazon.com. And you can find Mark at his website, www.evidenceofeternity.com. Mark, before you go, I'd like you to give us tonight's final word.
You know, all religions teach one thing that can be crystallized down to 2 words: be nice. And it may sound easy, but it's a lot harder than you might think, particularly when you're in traffic. But it comes down to this: treat people the way you want to be treated. Be nice.
Mark Anthony, thank you very much.
My Alien Life Podcast.
You can find my website at www.myalienlifepodcast.com, and please subscribe to my latest downloads at iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and at podbean.com. And please follow me and like me on Facebook and Twitter. My Alien Life is written and produced for broadcast at Studio 254 in the Northern Rocky Mountains. The music you are hearing is produced and created by Elion. You can find all Elion's work online at Heart Dance Records.